This screencast focuses on the third and final energy system that our body can use to resynthesize ADP into ATP. The aerobic system, or sometimes known as the oxidative system, is different to the ATPPC energy system and the lactic acid system, as it is considered aerobic in that it needs to function or can only function in the presence of oxygen. When we hear the word aerobic, we should associate the aerobic energy system with very low intensity but high duration activities or exercises, maybe something as a long jog or a long swim or rowing or marathon, a triathlon, anything that requires the body to exercise or sustain exercise over a prolonged period of time but is at a low intensity. If you can remember back to the ATPPC and the lactic acid system, one of the first things that you must recall is the fuels that each energy system uses in order to provide energy. The aerobic energy system will use glucose, glycogen, and fats to provide energy via coupled reactions, which is used to resynthesize ADP back into ATP. The aerobic system will use oxygen to completely break down one molecule of glucose into water and carbon dioxide in 3 different stages, which you need to know in depth. The first one is aerobic glycolysis, and the net gain of this stage is 2 ATP. The second stage is the Krebs cycle, and the net gain of ATP within this process is also 2 ATP, and the electron transport chain will yield the most amount of ATP, which is 34. So overall, the aerobic energy system has the capability of producing 38 ATP across these 3 stages, and this is one of the main advantages of the aerobic energy system over the other 2 energy systems, in that it can produce a larger amount of ATP molecules, and therefore you will be able to exercise or be active within this energy system for much longer. The first stage in the aerobic energy system is known as aerobic glycolysis, and if you can recall back to the screencast of the lactic acid system, the first stage involved was anaerobic glycolysis, which is shown here on the diagram on the left. Now, aerobic glycolysis and anaerobic glycolysis are the same process, apart from the fact that aerobic glycolysis has the presence of oxygen. So if we look here, and we should remember that because there's no oxygen present in anaerobic glycolysis, lactic acid will be produced. However, in aerobic glycolysis, because of the oxygen, there's no lactic acid that is accumulated, and the pyruvic acid will then be diverted further down into the aerobic system. Okay, so at this stage, I think it's important to remind you exactly what happens in the first stages, or the initial stages of glycolysis. Now, remember, the first thing that you should mention is that glycolysis will occur in the sarcoplasm of the cell. Next, you must mention that the stored levels of glycogen, either in the muscle or in the liver, will be broken down by the enzyme glycogen phosphorylase. Then, the enzyme phosphofructokinase will initiate the partial breakdown of the glucose molecule into pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid will then combine with coenzyme A to form acetyl-CoA. And this process of aerobic glycolysis will allow us to yield 2 molecules of ATP. The second stage of the aerobic energy system is known as the Krebs cycle, and this is a diagram of the processes involved within the Krebs cycle. And the first thing that you should mention again is where this reaction takes place within the cell, and for this particular cycle it takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. The second thing you should mention when describing the Krebs cycle is that the acetyl-CoA that was produced in aerobic glycolysis combines with an acid called oxaloacetic acid, and this will form citric acid. Once this citric acid is formed, it is further broken down into a series of complex reactions, as we know already occur in the matrix of the mitochondria, and 4 things will take place, or 4 events will take place that are very important to the Krebs cycle, And these 4 things you must memorize off by heart if you want to answer this question and get full marks. The first event to take place is carbon dioxide is produced and removed via the lungs, where gases exchange will occur. The second event that will take place is hydrogen atoms are removed, which is produced and removed, which is in a process known as oxidation. The third event that takes place is that energy is produced to resynthesize 2 molecules of ATP, similar to aerobic glycolysis. And the fourth and final event that takes place in the Krebs cycle is that the oxaloacetic acid that was initially formed will regenerate in order for the Krebs cycle to occur again. Before moving on to the third and final stage of the aerobic energy system, it's worth noting at this point an exam tip that you should consider, and that is you should never write an answer that aerobic glycolysis is the same as anaerobic glycolysis and assume that the examiner knows what you're talking about. You must write out the full process again, but then just add in the changes that occur in the presence of oxygen, where pyruvic acid is then diverted further down into the aerobic system. But do not make the mistake of saying that anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic glycolysis are the same, and then just assuming that the examiner knows what you're talking about, because you will not gain any credit for that. The third and final stage of the aerobic energy system is known as the electron transport chain, and again the first point that we're going to make is where this reaction takes place in the cell, and it's in the cristae of the mitochondria. The next stage in the electron transport chain is that the hydrogen atoms that were produced and removed from the Krebs cycle then combine with 2 coenzymes known as NAD and FAD, and this will form NADH and FADH, as you can see in the diagram here. The next stage is that NADH and FADH will then be carried down the electron transport chain, where hydrogen is then split into a hydrogen ion and an electron. As we already know, the reactions within the electron transport chain take place in the cristae of the mitochondria, and just like in the Krebs cycle where there's 4 events that you need to be aware of, there are 3 very important events which occur in the electron transport chain which you must know in adequate detail. The first event is that the hydrogen electron will split from the hydrogen atom, and then this will further pass down the electron transport chain. This will provide enough energy to resynthesize a total of 34 molecules of ATP. And finally, the hydrogen ion will combine with oxygen to form H2O, which we know is water. And this should make a bit of sense, because you should know that the simple equation for aerobic respiration is glucose plus oxygen gives carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And this is where the energy and water will come from within this reaction. Just like the 2 other energy systems that we went through, it's imperative that you learn the advantages and disadvantages of the aerobic system as well as the other 2, because if a question comes up that may be worded like critically evaluate the use of all of the energy systems to provide energy to resynthesize ATP, you must be aware and know in depth the advantages and disadvantages of all of the energy systems. So it's important that you don't neglect this area, and hopefully you can see from this picture. If not, it's in page 375. But just be aware of there are 5 advantages and 5 disadvantages. The first advantage of the aerobic energy system is that there's a large potential of glycogen and free fatty acid stores available as an efficient energy fuel. The second advantage is that there's efficient ATP resynthesis when there's good oxygen supply, which guarantees the breakdown of free fatty acids. There's a large ATP yield or resynthesis, which is there's 38 ATP from 1 molecule of glucose compared to only 2 ATP from the lactic acid system and 1 from the ATP-PC. So as I had mentioned before initially in the screencast, that's one huge advantage of the aerobic system, is that it yields a much more significant amount of ATP and therefore energy than the other 2 energy systems. The fourth advantage is that it will provide energy for low to moderate intensity for a high duration. So any exercise that lasts for more than 3 minutes up to an hour. So again, this can be a jog, a long row, or a long swim, anything that requires your body to sustain a prolonged period of exercise, but at a low intensity. And the fifth and final advantage of the aerobic system that you need to be aware of is that there are no fatiguing byproducts. So there's no lactic acid. The only byproducts are carbon dioxide and water, and they're easily removed. So it wouldn't be too detrimental to muscles. It wouldn't induce too much muscle fatigue, which allows you to exercise for a much longer period of time. So if we just look into the 5 disadvantages of the aerobic energy system as well, the first disadvantage is that there's a slower rate of ATP resynthesis compared to the lactic acid system. So even though the aerobic system can yield a much greater amount of ATP, it is a slower rate because there are more stages involved, and that is a major disadvantage of the energy system. The second disadvantage is that the aerobic energy system requires more oxygen supply, particularly if it wants to use free fatty acids. It requires 15% more oxygen. So if you're going very, very low intensity where you're using more oxygen, then free fatty acids or fats will be the primary fuel used to provide energy. The third disadvantage is that it's more complex series of reactions. So you should know this is probably the hardest energy system to learn, as there's a lot of events that take place within the 3 stages compared to the other 2 energy systems. So that's one disadvantage, in that it takes longer, and there's a more complex stage to it, or complex process in producing this energy. The fourth disadvantage is that it cannot resynthesize ATP at the start of exercise due to the initial delay of oxygen from the cardiovascular system. So that's one disadvantage you need to be aware of as well. And the fifth one, and finally, is that there's limited energy for ATP during high intensity short duration work. So although it produces a high amount of ATP, it cannot produce much or any for high intensity short duration work, because that will be solely dependent on the other energy systems, which can only produce a small amount of ATP. It would be a good idea to make sure that you know all of these advantages and disadvantages, and I would be a study tip. I would write these out for each energy system, all the advantages, all the disadvantages, and test myself regularly on them to make sure I am exactly aware of which is which. Okay, so the advantages and the disadvantages of which energy system, so that you know them off by heart, because you want to be prepared if a question did come up that required you to know these. Because there are quite a few, it requires a lot of learning, so make sure you do it over a long period of time. Don't try and cram all this information in, or you'll get confused. So write it out over and over again, and try and distinguish which advantage is for which energy system, and which disadvantage is for which energy system as well. And you'll be glad to know this is the final part of the screencast. Just a little point: when you're going through your textbook, of course, don't just use the screencasts solely for revision. You should be looking at your textbook and your worksheets and any other supporting material that I give you. But always read the little apply it boxes, and particularly the exam tips, because they are very, very important. And I can't go through all of them and go individually on this, but you have to make sure that you go through it in your own time. But just this little apply it box, it just kind of sums up the type of activity that the aerobic system is responsible for, and it was important to include just to kind of solidify your understanding of the energy system. So the aerobic system, we remember, is the only energy system that uses oxygen, and it's the primary energy system for ATP resynthesis during low to moderate intensity and high duration activity, which can last from 3 minutes up to several hours. Okay, the examples they give here are sports such as hockey and football. So if you play for football players, and being able to sustain activity over a 90-minute match, that will require a lot of the aerobic energy system to provide that. Other examples: long distance cycling, swimming, marathon events. You can think of Ironman events, triathlons. They're all predominantly dependent on the aerobic energy system. And just a little important note at the end here: the aerobic system is also active during recovery and stoppages, even during anaerobic activity, when it helps to restore ATP and PC stores. So remember that when we use our PC stores, which are limited, say in a 100-meter sprint, these will help to be resynthesized all by the aerobic system as well. And that brings us to the conclusion of this screencast and the 3 energy systems. Just a little point as well, make sure you read the section on fats and the training effects for aerobic type of training, and what that can, what adaptations that can cause to your body. That's very, very important to know. And as always, if there are any questions that you need help with, just come and see me. But again, the energy chapter is difficult, and it requires constant revision. So please don't try and cram this. Look over at any stage you can. It's more scientific than some of the other sections, so and there's a lot more information, but there are other elements to the energy chapter which you have to look over, including the recovery process and the energy continuum. So please look over those in depth, and if there are any questions, don't hesitate to find me.